This Congo tribunal has given us very detailed information regarding practices by mining corporations, contractual arrangements, and how they were abused, and how these practices were marked by a very strong disregard for artisanal mining and for local workers. I want to focus on 4 aspects, though, truth be said, I could focus on many more because it was quite an extraordinary session today. So a first point is that there is really much evidence, and it goes well beyond Congo, that MNCs, multinational corporations, have abused the law via devious interpretations of contracts and by shameless violations of contracts. We have heard quite a bit of detail about extreme instances of this. The settings are always complex, and I think that that is something to take into account. Let me add, we see these practices also in the United States. The gold mines of Montana, I would say, compete with the gold mines of Congo in terms of the extreme abuse of workers, of localities, poisoning water, killing animals, killing people. And they have succeeded in avoiding existing law for a very long time. Again, I want to emphasize, as I did yesterday, that we're dealing with a multi-sided global event. What Congo brings to the table is this extraordinary tribunal where we are really digging into a particular firm, especially Banro, and that is of enormous value because otherwise it's a very generic narrative. Now, a second point. One aspect often left out in discussions about the mining industry, but it actually came up today in one of the statements, is that with the financializing of more and more sectors, including sectors that deal with very material things like mining, a very specific wrinkle enters the matter. And that is, and it holds, by the way, for auto manufacturers, for everything that is manufacturing, especially by multinationals, and it certainly holds for mining. Every dollar extracted as profit on low-wage workers, on avoiding some environmental demand, on avoiding taxes, etc., is not only that actual money saved, extracted, gained. It has enormous multiplier effects in the stock valuation, in other words, in markets, of that company. A lot of the low-wage story, which is a very familiar story about manufacturing, outsourcing, it does not so much have to do with low wages per se. It has to be with the capacity of avoiding regulations, but it also has to do with that stock market valuation. Let me give you a very simple example. Goldman Sachs, a financial firm, decided to get seriously into the commodity trades. This is an example of aluminum. It has now come into the open, a lawsuit is at work, so I'm just giving you facts that are in the public domain. At one point, Goldman Sachs controlled about half of the aluminum supply in the world market. And a strange thing happened. The value of aluminum went up, 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 up. There was no clear explanation. Thanks to the truckers who were moving around the aluminum owned by Goldman Sachs from one place to another endlessly, those truckers that somehow we intersected with and began to talk with explained the matter. By delaying supply, they raised enormously the price of aluminum. Now, Goldman Sachs was willing to set up a huge set of storage spaces for aluminum, hire a big number of truckers who were kept moving around the aluminum, delaying delivery. Now, if Goldman Sachs is willing to go to those lengths I think we have a picture of what it might mean for mining companies as well. I hope my story was clear. It is in the public domain. A lawsuit has happened. They have been fined, and they have paid the fine because it was simply a shameless bit of financiering. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is the extent to which the financializing of materials, aluminum, gold, diamonds, whatever, diamonds is actually a bit different, how that increases the value of any sort of extraction that can be had. I think this is a big issue in the Congo mines. It is not just all the direct violations that they have done. There is another tendency, and that tendency is global, and it's not going to be easy to address that. That is a different issue from violating existing law in particular countries. Now, third, artisanal mining. I don't have a totally clear understanding, but it seems to me that here is a possibility, which is that while artisanal mining certainly is wrecking the environment as well, it does create jobs, as one of our judges explained, and it could be more benign vis-à-vis the environment. I do think that what I saw in some of the discussion is that promoting artisanal mining, which is not possible in all sectors, but it is possible in gold, also in other countries, by the way, like in Brazil or in Australia, that should probably be something that should be explored. I would have that as a recommendation. And that would in itself be the occasion, and that is probably why it matters, to generate new type of law that has the effect of not only protecting artisanal mining, but also protecting workers, because workers have an alternative way. Now, fourth point, the evidence that we heard, but also the evidence that exists in the larger sort of, world, so to speak, of the data world, is overwhelming. That not only Banro, about whom we heard quite a bit in this meeting, but all kinds of other corporations have rarely compensated workers, that which they replace and destroy, in this case artisanal workers, and governments for their fair share. They simply cheat. That financial circuit that I brought up is a new incentive, but they were all doing this before this new incentive. What I do see is that the new incentive, the financializing, brings in an added obstacle to straightening that out. There is a question in there that was raised by some of our presenters. Are the governments too afraid of these corporations? Are they too corrupt? Is there an absence of law that they can use as instruments? A whole range of issues here. Now, the fifth and last point, the Madame Zach Maas from EHCR presented one, I would say, vector of contesting. That is a vector that is not always strongly supported by governments, by home governments of either the corporations or the place like Congo where those corporations go and work. It is a vector that should be pursued, and I want to commend the EHCR for the work that they're doing there. But clearly, governments have to become key actors. I think that Mr. Rohner, in his presentation, also signaled some of the possibilities that governments have. The basic standard attitude is that governments are basically sort of powerless. I will not accept that. We always have had governments, and the history of Africa shows us that too. I can think of Patrice Lumumba, there are many others, who have had the courage to contest. Patrice Lumumba's case, it was an organized assassination. It was serious stuff, part of a larger Cold War scenario, but that kind of battle by governments has to continue. Right now, governments are in a weak position, whether it is in the United States or whether it is in Congo, whether it is in, I don't know about Germany. Germany is always very special on these things, but many governments So governments should work together. These have to be global treaties. When I see what the new trade partnerships, so-called trade partnerships, they're really investment treaties that give corporations even more power. No state can intervene. A business dispute, the judges become the lawyers of the corporations. The Congo case has dwelt on mining, that it should really be an example and a stimulus for a much larger landscape than mining, because the corporations are only gaining more rights, and in some ways, we, the citizens, are losing certain rights. It's a kind of invisible story, but it is there. Thank you very much.